The story of Samson is one of the most fascinating and profound in the Bible, full of moments of glory and tragedy. He was a man chosen by God from birth, endowed with superhuman strength to free the people of Israel from the oppression of the Philistines. However, his life was not just marked by victories. On the contrary, it was a journey of ups and downs, where Samson often gave in to his weaknesses and impulses. Her story teaches us valuable lessons about faith, redemption, and the true meaning of strength. It all started with a promise. The people of Israel lived in difficult times, suffering under the relentless rule of the Philistines. In the midst of this oppression, God chose an unlikely family to accomplish something great. An angel appeared to a woman who was barren, telling her that she would be the mother of a special son. Imagine her astonishment when she heard that. She, who had never been able to have children, was now destined to bring into the world someone who would be a liberator for Israel. The angel was clear. This boy will be a Nazirite from the womb, consecrated to God. This meant that he had to follow very specific rules. Not drinking wine, not touching anything unclean, and, most notable of all, never cutting his hair. Samson's birth was like a ray of hope for his family and the people, a sign that God had not forgotten them. From an early age, he carried a great destiny with him, and everyone knew it. The boy Samson grew strong, fearless, but what few knew was that his strength did not just come from his muscles, but from a much greater connection with the divine. Samson's life followed an unusual course. Since he was little, he knew he was different from the other boys in the village. His strength grew impressively, and everyone around him realized that there was something special about him. But it wasn't just his physical strength that made him stand out. He bore the mark of being a Nazirite, a person set apart for God. He could not cut his hair, nor drink wine, and there was constant care that he would not break this sacred vow. As the years passed, his fame began to spread. There was something almost mystical about his figure. He walked around with a confidence that only those on a special mission possess. The Israelite people saw in Samson the hope of better days, someone who could challenge them to come out from under Philistine rule. After all, everyone knew that the Philistines were a powerful, merciless people, always looking for ways to further subjugate Israel. And that's where Samson, with all the strength God gave him, seemed to be the answer. But Samson's strength was a gift that needed to be guarded jealously. What few knew was that his true strength came not from his muscles, but from his fidelity to the vow he and his parents had made to God. This was something precious, almost invisible, but it defined his entire existence. However, he was beginning to feel invincible, as if nothing could stop him. And it was then that life presented him with an unexpected challenge. While Samson was walking through one of the valleys of his land, distracted in his thoughts, something unexpected happened. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a deafening roar. Before him appeared a young, wild, hungry lion. The beast advanced with frightening speed, its eyes fixed on Samson, as if it knew that he was the only worthy opponent for such a clash. Samson, for a brief moment, remained motionless. Any other man, upon seeing that creature, would have fled or looked for some type of weapon. But Samson was not like the others. He had no time to think. There was no sword within reach, only his own hands. And then, as if something powerful took hold of him, a supernatural impulse coursed through his body. With bare hands, he charged at the lion. The confrontation was quick, but unforgettable. With strength that seemed beyond strength, Samson grabbed the lion by the jaws and, with a ferocious movement, tore him in half, as if he were breaking a piece of bread. The silence that followed was profound. There, on the ground, lay the lion, defeated by a simple man. But Samson knew that this victory was not just his. There was something more at stake. That strength came from God, and he felt it in every fiber of his body. The dead lion was just the beginning of something bigger, a harbinger of even more intense challenges he would face. Without telling anyone about what had happened, he went on his way. However, the memory of the dead lion remained in his mind. Some time later, Samson returned to the path where he had faced the lion. That moment still resonated in his memory as a feat he knew was more than a simple show of strength. As he approached the location, he decided to look at what was left of the animal. And there, inside the lion's carcass, something extraordinary awaited him. A swarm of bees had built a hive in the body of the dead animal. The smell of honey in the air was irresistible. Samson bent down, stretched out his hand, and collected the honey that flowed from the hive. The sweet taste melted in your mouth. Who could have imagined that something so pleasant would come from such a fierce and deadly creature? This was more than a coincidence. It was almost as if nature itself was revealing a hidden secret to him. From what was strong and dangerous, something sweet and precious came out. But just as he did with the lion, Samson kept it to himself, without telling anyone what he had found. With honey in hand, he continued on his way to preparations for his wedding to the Philistine woman he had chosen. Samson's wedding party was grand. The banquet was filled with food, music, laughter, and of course, many Philistine guests. Samson, in his confident and mysterious way, posed the riddle to everyone present. From what he eats came food, and from the strong came sweetness. He promised a great reward, fine and precious clothes, to whoever could solve the riddle. The Philistines, intrigued, accepted the challenge, but soon realized that they were facing something impossible to decipher. Days passed, and none of them could even come close to the answer. The pressure started to build. The pride of the Philistines was at stake. They could not lose to an Israelite, especially in their own land. Frustrated, the guests decided to resort to dishonest methods. They went to Samson's wife and, with threats, forced her to find out the answer. Fearing for her own life and the safety of her family, she relented. Day after day, she begged Samson to reveal the secret to her, saying that it was his duty to share everything with her, that now they were just one. Samson, at first, resisted. I knew the riddle was more than just a joke. It was a way of expressing the strength and mystery of what God had done in his life. But tired of her insistence, he ended up giving in and telling her the answer. She, in turn, revealed the secret to the Philistines. When the Philistines answered the riddle correctly, Samson realized the betrayal. He knew that the Philistines had only discovered the answer to the riddle because they forced his wife to cheat on him. The bitter taste of disappointment and injustice grew in his chest, fueling his fury. And Samson was not a man capable of swallowing defeats. With his extraordinary strength and cunning, he devised an unusual revenge, something that the Philistines could never predict. Samson took to the field, determined to teach his enemies a lesson. He captured 300 foxes, an impressive feat in itself, and in a bold move, tied torches to their tails. At dusk, when the sky was covered in darkness, he released the foxes in the plantations of the Philistines. The torches burning in the animals' tails turned the fields into a sea of fire. The flames devoured everything in sight, the wheat, the vineyards, and even the olive groves. Within hours, the Philistines' livelihood had turned to ashes. The smell of smoke spread quickly, and the Philistine people were in despair. There was nothing they could do to stop the fire from advancing. Samson's revenge was more devastating than any battle they could have fought with him. It was a clear message. Samson would not be deceived or underestimated. The fields of the Philistines were in ashes, but Samson's revenge only increased the fury of his enemies. Determined to capture him, the Philistines organized a hunt. Knowing that Samson was a gigantic threat, they went to Judah, Samson's people, demanding that they hand him over. The pressure on the Israelites was great, and they, fearful of reprisals, decided that the only way to avoid a massacre was to hand over their own hero. 1,000 men of Judah went up to the cave of Ethan, where Samson took refuge. Upon finding him, they asked him to surrender. "We don't want to kill you, but the Philistines will destroy us all if you continue," they said with fear in their eyes. Samson, with his fearless and imposing manner, agreed to be handed over, but on one condition, that he not be killed, they themselves, only to hand him over, tied to the Philistines. So Samson was bound with strong ropes and handed over to his enemies. They welcomed him with shouts of triumph, believing they had finally captured the man who had so terrified them, but they underestimated once again the power that dwelt within Samson. As the Philistines approached, shouting in celebration, the Spirit of God came upon him with renewed strength. The ropes that bound him broke like threads of burnt linen falling to the ground. And there, without any weapon in hand, Samson saw the peccary of a donkey. He took it, and with it, in an act of pure fury and divine strength, he overthrew 1,000 Philistines who surrounded him. The ground was covered with fallen enemies, and Samson's victory seemed increasingly impossible to challenge. After crushing 1,000 Philistines with nothing more than a single donkey's jaw, Samson was exhausted, almost without strength. Dust was still floating in the air, and the bodies of their enemies were all around. But in that moment of victory, something bothered him deeply. An overwhelming thirst dominated him, as if his entire body to have cried by water. He looked around, desperately searching for some source, but there in that desolate field, there was not a drop of water in sight. Desperation began to set in, and for the first time in a long time, Samson found himself vulnerable. He asked God out loud, "Lord, you have given me this great victory. Now am I going to die of thirst and be captured by my enemies?" His words spread throughout the valley, and then, in response to his cry, God opened a fissure in the earth, causing water to gush out from within. Samson drank, felt his strength renewed, and once again knew that the power he had was not something that came from himself. The source of his strength, both physical and spiritual, has always been linked to his connection with God. Still, temptation was never far away. Samson was a man guided by his impulses and desires, and it was at this point that he crossed paths with Delilah. She was not just an ordinary woman. Delilah had a seductive beauty which attracted Samson like never before. He, despite everything he had already experienced and overcome, could not see the danger in front of him. Attracted by her, Samson did not know that the Philistine leaders were ready to use Delilah as a weapon against him. The fascination that Delilah had on Samson was undeniable. He, who will face lions and 1,000 men, he now found himself surrendered to the charms of a woman whose beauty and cunning bewitched him in a way that no battle had ever done. Delilah, however, was not there just for Samson. The Philistine leaders, determined to destroy the man who had so often humiliated them, offered her a fortune in silver to discover the secret of his strength. And so Delilah began a dangerous game, a game of seduction and persistence. At first, Samson revealed nothing. He joked about the situation, perhaps believing he was in control. When Delilah, with her sweet eyes, asked him what the secret of his strength was, he lied. First he said that if it were tied with fresh ropes, it would lose its strength. She tried, and he broke them easily. Then he said that 7 new strings would make him weak, but again he broke the spell. Delilah, however, did not give up. He used sweet words, insisted, pressured, until Samson began to get tired of the insistence. Perhaps he was so confident of his invincibility that he did not see the real danger. It tormented him day and night like a constant current that wears away stone. And little by little, Samson gave in, increasingly fragile in the face of his seduction. Until, in a moment of weakness and tiredness, Samson told the truth. "My strength is in my hair. Since my birth, it has never been cut, as I am a Nazirite, consecrated to God. If they cut it, I will be as weak as any other man." And that's when everything started to fall apart. Samson, asleep on Delilah's lap, was completely vulnerable. It was a striking contrast. The strongest man in Israel, who had once destroyed entire armies, now rested in peace, unaware of the danger that surrounded him. While he slept, Delilah, with cold and precise hands, cut the 7 braids of his hair. With each hair that fell, Samson's divine strength grew stronger, Esvaya silently. When the last strand fell to the ground, he was no longer the invincible man they so feared. Delilah, satisfied, called the Philistines, who were already waiting in the shadows. They quickly invaded the room and, without Samson being able to react, tied him up. When he tried to free himself, something was different. The strength that had always accompanied him, the unshakable confidence he carried, was all gone. He pulled on the ropes, but this time, they didn't break. The feeling of helplessness took over him. At that moment, Samson realized that he had broken the sacred promise he had with God. The power that had once distinguished him among men had now left him. The Philistines, taking advantage of his weakness, not only captured him, but also blinded him. They gouged out his eyes, leaving him immersed in a physical darkness that reflected the spiritual blindness that had led him to that point. Samson, the man who had once been feared by everyone, was now taken as a prisoner, humiliated and defeated. They dragged him to Gaza, where he was chained and put to work, grinding grain like an animal. The strength that had once been his glory now seemed but a distant memory. While Samson was imprisoned, chained, humiliated and blind, the days dragged slowly by. He, who had once been the terror of the Philistines, was now reduced to a prisoner, turning the millstone like an animal. But as much as the Philistines believed they had completely destroyed the man who once defied them, something subtle and almost imperceptible began to happen. Samson's hair, the one that had been cut, began to grow back. Time passed, and with every inch of hair that returned, it seemed like a spark of his old strength began to rekindle within him. It wasn't just the hair that grew. His faith, previously neglected, also began to grow stronger. In the darkness of the prison, without being able to see the world around him, Samson had time to reflect. He remembered where his true strength came from, not from his muscles, not from his hair, but from God. And, in the silence of that mill, he began to cry out for a new opportunity, for a chance at redemption. The Philistines, on the other hand, were completely unconcerned. To them, Samson was no longer a threat. They celebrated his capture and used him as a trophy, showing the world that Israel's great warrior had been defeated. One day, they organized a great party in the temple of Dagon, their god, to celebrate their victory. Hundreds of Philistine leaders and thousands of people gathered at the temple to glorify their divinity and mock Samson. In the great temple of the Philistines, the crowd was in ecstasy. Laughter and screams echoed off the walls, and the sound of the party was deafening. Samson was brought to the center, guided by a boy, because without his eyes, he could not see the path. The Philistine leaders were amused to see him like this, reduced to a humiliated prisoner, and the people ridiculed him as if his power had been just a legend of the past. But as the crowd screamed, something deeper was happening inside Samson. He who had turned away from God felt that powerful presence again. There, amid mockery and contempt, Samson lifted his heart to God one last time. With his hands feeling the pillars that supported the temple, he said his final prayer, "Lord God, remember me. Give me strength once again so that I can take revenge on the Philistines for the sake of my eyes." Samson knew that the time for his redemption had arrived. He, who had so often used his strength impetuously, now asked God for just one more chance. With all his energy, he pushed the columns. The temple, loaded with thousands of people, began to shake. The stones, the ceiling, everything started to collapse. The crowd, which had previously laughed at their defeat, now screamed in terror. With one last effort, Samson brought the temple down on himself and his enemies. At that moment, he killed more Philistines than he had killed in his entire life. His death, although tragic, was the final act of his mission. And so, his story teaches us that no matter how much we make mistakes and go astray, God is always willing to give us a new chance as long as we seek from the heart. True strength is not in our hands, but in our faith and our connection with him. One of the first lessons Samson offers us is that true strength comes from God. Despite his invincible appearance, Samson was only strong because he was connected to a divine purpose. From his birth, he was chosen, and his extraordinary strength was a symbol of that choice. But like him, we can often forget where our strength comes from. We may think that everything depends on us, but in reality, when we are separated from God, we become vulnerable, like Samson became when he lost his connection with his Creator. Another important lesson is the danger of ignoring the signs. Time and again, Samson played with danger, especially with Delilah. He was warned, but in his arrogance and self-sufficiency, he continued to ignore the consequences. This reminds us that when we don't listen to the warnings that life gives us, we can end up irreversibly harming ourselves. He moved away from the guidelines that protected him until finally he fell. Furthermore, the story of Samson also tells us about redemption. Even after his mistakes, even after being humiliated and defeated, Samson found the strength to turn to God. In his final moment, he recognized where his strength truly came from and cried out for mercy, and God heard him. This shows us that it is never too late to seek a new chance, to redeem ourselves, and that no matter how much we have failed, God is always ready to restore us. Finally, Samson's life reminds us that our gifts and talents must be used wisely and responsibly. He had it all: strength, a divine calling, a clear purpose, but time and time again, he let his impulses and desires take him away from that purpose. And how many times do we do the same? If you liked Samson's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.